The Wars of the Three Kingdoms in China, 184 to 280 AD, is one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, with estimates of 30 to 40 million deaths. It all began in the late Han Dynasty, when the empire was crumbling under corruption and peasant unrest. In 184 AD, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted, a massive uprising led by desperate farmers who believed in a faith promising equality. While the rebellion was crushed, it left the empire in shambles and opened the door for powerful warlords to seize control. Three major powers eventually emerged: Wei, led by the ruthless and brilliant Cao Cao in the north; Shu, under Liu Bei, who claimed to restore the Han Dynasty's legitimacy; and Wu, ruled by Sun Quan. These three kingdoms fought constantly, forming and breaking alliances, with one of the most famous clashes being the Battle of the Red Cliffs in 208 AD. At this battle, Shu and Wu joined forces and used fire ships to burn Cao Cao's massive fleet, halting his attempt to unify China. But the real devastation of this period wasn't just the combat, it was also the fact that there was endless conscription which drained villages from its people and the famine and disease that spread everywhere. This led to entire regions being depopulated, and by the time the wars ended in 280 AD, China's population had been reduced by tens of millions. The Lushan Rebellion, 755 to 763 AD, was one of the bloodiest uprisings in history, with a death toll estimate ranging from anywhere from 13 to 36 million people. It erupted during the Tang Dynasty, a time when China was at its cultural peak. The empire relied heavily on frontier generals to defend its borders, and one of its most powerful was An Lushan, a military governor. He controlled a massive army and enjoyed the personal favor of Emperor Xuanzong. However, An Lushan eventually turned against the court and led a full-scale revolt. In 755 AD, he marched his army south and captured the eastern capital Luoyang, and then advanced on the main capital Chang'an. The Tang court panicked, and the emperor fled, and in the chaos, his own guards forced him to execute his beloved consort, Yang Guifei, who was blamed for corruption and mismanagement. And for a moment, it seemed as if An Lushan might topple the dynasty altogether. He even declared himself emperor of a new state, the Yan dynasty. But as the rebellion dragged on, An Lushan was assassinated by his own son in 757. Now the fighting would continue under new rebel leaders, but the Tang dynasty, even though it was weakened, managed to hold on with the help of regional warlords and foreign allies. Still, this war devastated China and millions were killed. The Jewish-Roman War, also called the First Jewish Revolt in 66 to 73 AD, was estimated to have about 1 million deaths, most of them Jewish civilians. Now, tensions had been boiling for decades in Judea under Roman occupation. Heavy taxation and corruption by the Roman governors created massive resentment, and then in 66 AD, riots broke out in Jerusalem after Roman officials seized money from the Jewish temple treasury. The unrest quickly escalated into a full-blown revolt, and Jewish rebels managed to defeat the local Roman garrison, shocking the empire. Rome would respond with overwhelming force. The general Vespasian, and later his son Titus, led legions into Judea to crush the rebellion. The Romans systematically destroyed towns and massacred thousands as they advanced. The climax came in 70 AD when the Romans besieged Jerusalem, and while the city's defenders fought desperately, the Romans eventually breached the city, where they burned the Second Temple, the holiest site in Judaism, leaving only the Western Wall that stands today. Thousands were slaughtered, and many of the survivors were sold into slavery. The last major holdout of this war was at Masada, a fortress where Jewish rebels, known as the Sicarii, resisted until 73 AD. According to the historian Josephus, when the Romans finally stormed the fortress, they found that nearly all of the 960 defenders had chosen mass suicide over capture. Overall, this war was a catastrophe, leading to many casualties. The Gallic Wars, 58 to 50 BC. The Gallic Wars were a series of brutal campaigns waged by Julius Caesar to conquer Gaul. Ancient estimates suggest around 1 million people were killed, with modern estimates pointing at more hundreds of thousands. Now, the war began when local Gallic tribes rebelled against Roman influence and raided Roman territories. Caesar, as governor of Cisalpine Gaul, saw both a chance to protect Roman interests and an opportunity to boost his own power. Over the next 8 years, Caesar systematically campaigned against Gaul, employing clever military tactics and brutal reprisals. He faced a variety of tribes with different fighting styles, from the Nervi to the Helvetii. Now, one of the most famous battles was the Siege of Alesia in 52 BC. Despite being outnumbered, Roman discipline allowed Caesar to starve the Gauls into submission. And Caesar himself documented this campaign in Commentari de Bello Gallico, giving Rome a dramatic account of both his genius but also the scale of devastation. And by the end of 50 BC, Gaul was effectively under Roman control, greatly expanding the Republic's territory. The Punic Wars, 264 to 146 BC. The Punic Wars were a series of 3 devastating wars between Rome and Carthage, 2 of Mediterranean's most powerful civilizations. Historians estimate anywhere from 1 to 2 million deaths, making it one of the deadliest conflicts of the ancient world. The First Punic War began in 264 BC over control of Sicily, a strategically vital island. Rome, primarily a land power, built a navy almost from scratch, and after years of naval battles, they forced Carthage to surrender Sicily. Now, the Second Punic Wars from 218 to 201 BC is the most famous, largely to the Carthaginian general Hannibal. See, Hannibal stunned Rome by crossing the Alps with war elephants, a feat that at the time seemed impossible. Hannibal would then win several battles on Italian soil, including the infamous Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, where tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed. Now, despite these victories, Hannibal was never able to capture Rome itself. Eventually, Rome counterattacked Carthage's home territory in North Africa under Scipio Africanus, forcing Hannibal to return home, and ultimately he would be defeated at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, was shorter but ultimately much more catastrophic for Carthage. See, Rome, fearing a resurgence, destroyed the city in its entirety and killed many inhabitants and sold the rest to slavery. The Roman Civil Wars were a series of internal conflicts that tore apart the Roman Republic, with estimated casualties ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Now, these wars began as rivalries between powerful generals and politicians that escalated into full-scale armed conflicts. One of the first major confrontations was between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. After Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BC, he famously declared the die is cast as he marched on Rome and sparked a civil war that lasted several years. Now, the war featured numerous battles across the Italian peninsula, Gaul, and the Mediterranean. Caesar's strategic brilliance and the loyalty of his legions allowed him to defeat Pompey's forces, culminating in Pompey's flight to Egypt, where he was assassinated. But the conflict did not end there. See, Caesar faced further opposition from remnants of the Pompeian faction and other senators who feared his rising power. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, Rome was plunged into another cycle of civil wars, this time between Mark Antony and Octavian, later Augustus, and the conspirators. One of the most famous battles was the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, effectively ending the last major Roman civil war. The prolonged conflicts and the large-scale battles did lead to an enormous loss of life and would lead to the birth of the Roman Empire. The Marcomannic Wars 166 to 180 AD were a series of brutal conflicts between the Roman Empire and the various Germanic tribes, with estimated casualties in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people. Now, these wars erupted during the reign of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who faced pressure on multiple fronts. The Germanic tribes began crossing into the Danube River into Roman territory, and taking advantage of the empire's ongoing struggles with disease and internal instability. The Romans were initially caught off guard, suffering defeats in the frontier provinces. Marcus Aurelius personally took command and led campaigns deep into hostile territory along the Danube. The fighting involved large-scale battles, sieges, and continuous skirmishes that would devastate the countryside and leave many dead. Despite the Roman military prowess, the tribes proved resilient and forced years of continuous campaigns. And one interesting thing about the Marcomannic Wars was that they took a long time. The combination of the open field battles and the harsh winters caused significant casualties on both sides. Also, the empire faced a major population hit due to the Antonine Plague, which itself contributed to a high death toll. Eventually, by 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius had stabilized the frontier and negotiated treaties with some tribes. The Goguryeo-Sui Wars 598 to 614 AD were a series of brutal campaigns between China's Sui dynasty and the Korean kingdom, with estimated deaths reaching at least 300,000. The Sui Empire's Emperor Yang dreamed of reuniting the lands once controlled by earlier Chinese dynasties and saw the Korean kingdom as both a threat and an obstacle to that vision. However, the Korean kingdom was a formidable military power with fortified mountain strongholds and a history of resisting Chinese invasions. The first major campaign came in 598 AD, when Emperor Wen of Sui sent an enormous force, both by land and sea. But storms wrecked the navy and disease ripped through the army, and so the Korean kingdom's defenses held firm. Undeterred, Emperor Yang launched an even bigger invasion. In 612 AD, he mobilized one of the largest armies the ancient world had ever seen, with some Chinese records claiming over 1 million soldiers. The forces were marched into Korea and laid siege to the capital, Pyongyang. But supply lines were stretched thin, and the Korean general Uji Mundok outmaneuvered the Chinese with deception and ambushes. The massive Sui army, starving and demoralized, was eventually crushed at the Battle of the Sosu River, where tens of thousands drowned or were slaughtered. The wars dragged on until 614 AD, but the Sui suffered catastrophic losses in manpower and resources, which would lead to the empire being bankrupt and rebellions being sparked, and eventually the collapse of the Sui dynasty itself. And so remember to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.